before I got into this presentation, I wanted to give you a little bit of background on why I wanted to do this whole project, which is my thesis project for my master's program at Bowling Green State. I was inspired to do this project because I went to the Mothman Festival in 2018. At the time of my life, I had a blast just seeing all these other weird people all gathering around this one thing, and that one thing was, well, Mothman. And I've never really been to a festival like that before, and I was so interested in how this town, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, would basically take this one urban legend and make it their mascot and their sole thing that people came to the town for, primarily. And I've loved monsters my whole life, so I read about urban legends as far back as I can remember. In fact, I've known about Mothman since 2006, before it was even really popular, because of a really vague TV show that was on Discovery Kids one time during the mid-2000s called Mystery Hunters. It's no longer around, of course, and I can't find it on video cassette anywhere, but that was the reason why I fell in love with the legend of Mothman. Let's go to the next slide here. Okay. But before we get into the meat of my presentation, I wanted to tell you guys what a cryptid is, which is what it's what realistic monsters, I would say, are called. Monsters, a cryptid is monsters and life forms that are rumored to exist, but have not yet been proven by the scientific community. I mean, you've heard of Bigfoot, you've heard of the Loch Ness Monster, and they're cryptids because there's been sightings of these things, but they've never been confirmed by science. But of course, we also have Mothman, the Flatwoods / Grafton County Green Monster, and the Grafton Beast, which were all cited by real people, but nobody can confirm if they were real creatures or not. And these last three creatures, of course, were all found in the mountainous state of West Virginia. Next slide. And these monsters I focused on were Mothman, Flatwoods Monster, and the Grafton Monster. And Mothman comes from Point Pleasant, Mason County, West Virginia, and Gallipolis, Ohio, which is right across the river from Point Pleasant, West Virginia. The Flatwoods Monster is found in Flatwoods, Braxton County, West Virginia, and the Grafton Monster is found in Taylor County, West Virginia, and the town of Grafton, of course. Next slide. I wanted to start with Mothman because, as you can see by my shirt here, Mothman's my absolute favorite. There have been at least 100 sightings from 1966 to 1967, and during that time it was a regional phenomenon called Mothmania, where everybody would just pile into the back of their trucks and go hunting out in the woods outside of Point Pleasant trying to search for this thing. Newspapers were printed about it. People just called it a big bird, but it was sighted mostly in Point Pleasant, but there was also a lot of sightings in Gallipolis, which is why the Unnatural History exhibit is including it in their displays. It's known for its dark, shadowy figure and big red eyes. With all the witnesses that were really the most prevalent, the big red eyes were the most noticeable thing on this creature. Next slide, please. Like I said before, the Mothman was known to be just a really big bird, as some people said. Which that bird is thought to be the sandhill crane. And those birds can sometimes have a 5-foot wingspan, and they're known for their red coloring around their eyes. But I can't think of a crane that would grow to have a 10-foot wingspan like that, like some witnesses said. But then again, most of these sightings were at night. So when you're afraid of something that in the dark, things get 10 times bigger. People said this bird was thought to have blown off its flight path on the way down south and just gotten stuck in West Virginia for a year, which is completely plausible, but again, nobody can confirm it. Well, the last sighting of Mothman was in December of 1967 around the Silver Bridge of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And that was a few days before the infamous Silver Bridge collapse happened, which claimed 46 lives, and two of the people were never found. But that bridge disaster is what prompted the Bridges Act, and what basically made bridges a lot safer today, because this bridge basically fell due to human disrepair. It was ready to collapse at any time. So since people saw Mothman around that bridge, they thought of it as an omen of sorts, that something bad was really going to happen, because it was seen just a few days before, and then boom, it fell down. Next slide, please. And then we have the Flatwoods Green Monster, which on September 12th, 1952, a group of boys were playing in Flatwoods, West Virginia at their elementary school when they saw something basically fall out of the sky, and then they gathered up a few more guys to go look at it along with the mother of a couple of those boys. Her name was Miss Kathleen May. And the boys and that mother went up on the hill where they smelled like a rotten egg smell, and something came out from behind a tree, and then they saw the figure that you can see in the pictures there, which, had a supposedly spade-shaped head, green body, red face. There's a lot of reports that say it was a mechanical monster and like a physical, organic being. In fact, this event was such a big deal when it got reported. Members of Project Blue Book, which was stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base here in Ohio, went to go investigate it later on, where nothing conclusive was found. Next slide, please. The government was heavily involved with this investigation, like I just said, and the mother, Miss Kathleen May, and one of the older boys present, Eugene Lemon, went to CBS in New York, where they presented that photo that you can see in the slide. And nobody can figure out where that particular show is now, but it would be really cool to see that broadcast. Next slide. The Grafton Monster was a little bit lesser known because only one or two people saw it, but it was seen. The most prevalent sighting that was reported was on June 16th, 1964, by reporter Robert Cockrell of the Grafton Sentinel. He was driving home one night and he saw something on the side of the road lumbering around. He slowed down and saw this hairless creature just around the road. He couldn't believe his eyes. He said it was whistling as well. He thought it was a naked polar bear, which would have been funny because the nearest zoo is in Pittsburgh, over 50 miles away. Next slide, please. But why are there so many monsters in West Virginia, Dee? Well, a lot of West Virginia's immigrants came from Ireland and Scotland. If you know anything about Ireland and Scotland, there's a lot of hills and mountainous regions of the area. And since they had a lot of stories of fairies and monsters living in the hills, those stories turned into aliens and Mothman living in the West Virginia hills as time went on. Also, a lot of these sightings happened in the Cold War in the 50s and 60s. So, tensions were already high. Anything that seemed out of the ordinary could be seen as either, red invasion or aliens, because there was an alien UFO craze at that time. Next slide, please. And because of these stories being so fantastical, people just started either accepting it as part of their local folklore or outright rejecting it. Well, it can't be proven these creatures are real. Something fantastical and, impactful happened to the point where, well, they made an industry around it. And that's pretty much the main point of my thesis. A lot of these communities have cashed in on these icons like Mothman and the Flatwoods Monster, which I will get into a little bit sooner. But it's so interesting. It was so interesting to me to see these little towns become tourist meccas in the middle of West Virginia. Why do I care about this? Well, for one, it's really cool. Two, I've always been interested in how monsters have become pop culture phenomenons, how they're so prevalent within mainstream culture these days, how cryptids, as they're called, have become popular in the last 5-10 years. In West Virginia, monsters have been fascinating to me in particular because there's all sorts of weird things that happen in that state. In fact, their motto is wild and wonderful, and emphasis on the wild. And also the game Fallout 76, which came out in 2018, really helped, spur me to want to figure out more about these things. I went to the Mothman Festival in 2018, and then Fallout 76 came out right after. And if you've ever played that game, all three of these creatures are in that game. So, I'm like, okay, I'm going to base my whole thesis around these really obscure things. Next slide, please. Process for me was getting to reach out to the mayors of both towns, which Mayor Point Pleasant never got back to me. Mayor Flatwoods, very helpful and connected me to the right people. Reached out to the hotel I was staying at in Point Pleasant. And if you know anything about hotel owners in small towns, they know everybody. And I also contacted directors of tourism in both Mason and Braxton County for their help, which they were very helpful and also connected me to even more people that I ever would have thought of by myself. Not to mention, with these leads in hand, I set out on my way on May 29th, 2019. This picture is taken on a very nice sunny morning where the Silver Bridge collapsed in 1967. I figured it'd be a nice intro to things for this particular subject. But I was there from May 29th to June 2nd, 2019. Next slide. This is the Lowe Hotel, which was built in 1901 and also was the hotel of choice for... Oh goodness, his name is escaping me. But the man who wrote the Mothman prophecies. During his time in Point Pleasant, this is where he stayed. And it was also in the Mothman Prophecies movie, which helped spur the Mothman craze. Next slide, please. And in Point Pleasant, there's a lot of folk art and cultural imagery that you might see when you're around. If you can tell, that's Mothman holding an American flag. And if you don't think there's anything more American than Mothman holding an American flag, I want you to figure out something that is more American and get back to me. Next slide, please. And there was a ton of flea markets around Point Pleasant, which is a pretty big thing in West Virginia to go and find antiques. But here, people were selling like handcrafted art and painted rocks, wrought iron imagery. Next slide, please. Wood art. You can, if your mom has a live, laugh, love sign in their living room, you can have one that says Mothman on it. And everyone on the main street of that town had some sort of handcrafted folk art that was made specifically for their place of business, but reflected their town's image of Mothman. Next slide. There were T-shirts, mugs, and tree trunks with things painted on them. Next slide. And even in the little coffee shop that's right next to the Mothman statue, which I will get to in a bit, people would take this little notebook from, travelers would take this little notebook and draw their own version of Mothman, which is in itself is a form of folk art. You have people from Australia drawing their own little Mothman, and someone made Mothman as Freddie Mercury, which I thought was hilarious. But it was just so interesting to see everyone's different takes on this one legend that nobody can agree on if it existed or not. Next slide, please. And in that same coffee shop, you could have your picture taken as Mothman with a little mug of coffee. And that coffee shop was pretty important. Next slide, please. Because you could get Mothman cookies from there. And as you can see, Mothman droppings, which were just espresso beans covered in chocolate. And Foodways, folkloric foods. This is a prime example of that, considering you can't get Mothman cookies anywhere else in town except for this one little place, but it still represents the entirety of Point Pleasant as a whole. Next slide, please. And then you have Mothman Pizza. And if you are familiar with Mothman Pizza, you might have seen it on BuzzFeed, which helps popularize this one particular pizzeria, but also because this pizzeria is where the first witnesses came to after seeing Mothman. They tried to figure out what to do. Should they call the police? And they sat in this pizzeria and, well, just waited. But today, they're known for that and for being on BuzzFeed. And when I went there to talk with the waitresses, I said, so this is the place where the witnesses came, right? She said, yeah, but people ask us more about BuzzFeed now than those people. And the Mothman Pizza, while good, was too much for one person, let me tell you. This town takes its cultural imagery so seriously, would you mind going to the next slide, that they included it on their city seal. They put Mothman on the city seal, which I think is the most amazing thing in the world. You can see it in that little red circle right there. Now that particular Mothman is based off of another Mothman in town, the most popular Mothman in town. Next slide, please. And that would be the Mothman statue. I'm sure if you're interested in Mothman, you've probably heard of the Mothman statue. It's a pretty big statue, but if you can see it. I'm 6'8", and I'm not nearly half as tall. Maybe just over half as tall as that statue. Well, the Mothman statue, I was saying, was built in 2003 by a local sculptor by the name of Bob Roach. He had originally made a lot of other historical figure statues in the area, but his most popular one ended up being Mothman, which was funny because he had no idea who Mothman was when city planner Charles Humphrey commissioned it. Charles Humphrey came up to him one day. He said, "Hey, would you want to make a statue of Mothman?" And Mr. Roach said, "What the hell's a Mothman?" Even though he had lived just right down the street from Point Pleasant. And even during the COVID-19 pandemic, people still visit it because it's outside. And there's also a stream of it that you can see 24 hours a day, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. Next slide, please. That statue is right next to the Mothman Museum, right here. The only Mothman Museum in Point Pleasant, by the way. Next slide, please. And that opened in 2005, right after the statue, but it moved to its current location in 2006. Ever since then, they've been slowly expanding in the building where they are now. And it's owned by local resident and teacher Jeff Walmsley, who's written a number of books on Mothman, so it's fitting that he has his own museum about it. And he's opened it basically to showcase all the things he had collected over the years relating to Mothman, and all the different articles that had come out in the local papers, and not to mention movie paraphernalia from the Mothman prophecies after it got done filming. And it hosts the annual Mothman Festival every year, which this year was obviously canceled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It would have been in its 20th year this year, which is a shame, but hopefully it'll be around next year. It was once a few tables out in the front of the statue, but now it's the entire main street. They shut down the whole main street of Point Pleasant, and 10,000 people descend on a small community of 4,000. And boy, does it cause some problems. With lodging, at least. Next slide, please. As you can see, I survived a near attack by Sasquatch and Mothman there. But that's at the Mothman Festival in 2018. Next slide, please. And that takes me to my next location in my research trip, Flatwoods and Sutton, West Virginia. And as you can see there, the sign proudly proclaims they're the home of the green monster. Next slide, please. This is the Braxton County Monster Museum, which recently opened about 5 years ago because they wanted to kind of capitalize off of their monster in the way that Mothman did. But they're still growing as much, too. Next slide. You can see all the little stickers that artists have provided to the museum over the years, including a lot of local artists who really try to get their name out there through this thing, this one central thing that is popular all over the world. Next slide, please. They even had the West Virginia Filmmakers Festival there a couple of years ago, and, well, the Flatwoods Monster was the central theme of it. Not to mention, in the museum, they have all sorts of little knickknacks and doodads there, highlighting the monster and its effect on popular culture. And also, Governor Earl Ray Tomblin, he once proclaimed September 12th, 2016 to be Grafton County Monster Day, which I think is amazing to have a holiday named after something that might not even exist. Next slide. They have all sorts of little sculpted figures, hand-knit little stuffed toys, books, magazine articles, and video games, all based off of the Flatwoods Monster. The owner of the museum takes a lot of pride in trying to find even the most obscure items from this monster. Next slide. The costume you see on the left there was once used in a 5th grade play talking about the legend of the monster. I hadn't seen this play until a long time after my research trip. It was right around the day the monster landed on September 12th is when I was given an email by the owner of the museum saying, "Hey Dee, I found this play that I know you'll really like." And it turns out it was the play that used that costume, which a local community putting on a production based off of a local legend, you can't get any more folklorish than that. And that little costume on the right is a child's costume that was made for the original Flatwoods Monster Festival for a child. Boy, is a little tiny Flatwoods monster. Next page. If you remember that Mothman costume that nearly attacked me in that picture I showed you earlier, the company that made that costume also made this one. And this is basically what the Monster Museum owner uses for public appearances and getting the name of the monster out there for people to come and enjoy it. Next one, please. And in Flatwoods, there's a tiny little diner called the Spot Dairy Bar and Restaurant. And this diner is very special because it's like 200 yards away from the hill where the monster landed in 1952. And it also has fantastic ice cream and food. So you'll see on the next slide there. Let's call it a saucer sandwich. And it was absolutely amazing. They had all these little sandwiches named after different alien-themed icons, like the Area 51, the Roswell, the Gray sandwich, which I think had poop on it, gray poop on it. That one was a Roswell sandwich. And also, this Monster Cup is special because it's the only place you can get it. So that means, they can charge whatever they want for it because it's unique to this area. And of course, they're going to bank off of what makes them special. Next slide, please. Flatwoods also does a lot of folk art, and not really through the form of giant statues, which I would love to see a giant metal statue made of the Flatwoods monster, but they have their own set of chairs that are strewn about all around the county, and it's also a little tourist gimmick that the Tourism Bureau and also the Monster Museum does. If you visit all these chairs and take pictures with them, you'll get a little sticker of the Flatwoods monster saying, "Free Braxy," which is the nickname the museum gave to the monster to try and make it more Grafton County's thing, not just the small village of Flatwoods. Next page, please. These chairs are very tall, as you could see. Taller than me, even. But I did my own little hop around the county and got my own little sticker. Next page, please. And this blanket was done by the students of Flatwoods Elementary School, which is the same school that the boys originally came from in 1952. This teacher's class, she had made a big quilt with little quilt squares that her students all designed. As you can see, there's a lot of them that have the Flatwoods monster on it, and a couple of them that have Mothman on it. Even kids love learning about this thing because it makes them, well, it makes where they come from special and not just another part of West Virginia. Next page, please. Even the volunteer fire department made the Flatwoods monster their mascot. And they help they do fundraisers where they sell this particular design, and that's how they help keep all their equipment up to date. And these shirts sell pretty quick, so they have pretty good equipment because of that reason. And this is John Gibson and the famous Flatwoods Monster Lantern. Now this lantern is special in particular because it was pretty much the first piece of West Virginian monster merchandise ever made. Honestly, it was probably the first piece of monster merchandise, period, ever made. I can't really think of anything Sasquatchy that came out until after the 60s, when all these little videos were starting to go to the press. But this man, John Gibson, helped design this particular lantern because in West Virginia, well, a lot of people didn't have power even in the 50s and 60s. So he wanted to make something that was unique to the local culture and that families could hang the lanterns up inside their homes. So he used this design and pushed it through at a young entrepreneurs club in the local high school, where they sat on the side of the highway and sold these things for like $20 a pop, which in the 60s was still a lot of money, but it went towards a good cause, and it made it one of the most popular souvenirs to ever come from that area. Next page, please. And there's pretty much no place in that little general area around Sutton and Flatwoods where you can't buy a lantern. The local conference center that was made as a centralized meeting location for state representatives, the gas station that's there right outside of the Walmart that was built in Flatwoods. Anywhere that you can buy something, you can get a Flatwoods monster lantern, but you can only get this thing in Flatwoods. So that's what makes these lanterns unique. And it represents the local artistic talent of the community too. Next slide, please. Just like the Mothman Festival, the Flatwoods Monster Festival was revived last year. And this was a weekend filled with fun, folklore, and games. It went in conjunction with something called CharCon Bonus Round, which is a smaller version of the convention in Charleston, West Virginia that happens every year. But this is just people playing some tabletop games, buying some nerdy stuff, like, for example, a knitted version of the Flatwoods Monster and the little knitted plush toy of Mothman that I bought. There were all sorts of panels about paranormal things that happen in Braxton County, not just the monster, but also all the ghosts that are around there, and the UFO sightings that have been in that area in particular. But with the festival, there was a parade, there were vendors set up for the monster, and also bingo, because people love bingo at a Flatwoods Monster Festival. I mean, it was Flatwoods Monster themed, so. Next page, please. This takes us to the Flatwoods Monster around the world. Like I said earlier, it had a pretty big impact, both locally and internationally. It has a big presence overseas, but it's primarily in Japan. After my initial research, I had gotten the email of Miss Rie Matsubara in San Diego, California, who had as much of an interest in this monster as me. I had started communicating with her and started bringing up the questions of, why do you think Japan in specifically, she's a native Japanese person, why do you think Japan specifically likes this monster? And, well, she and I set off using what resources we could through the internet to find out. She once saw the monster as a UFO fan in the 60s and 70s, and then she saw it being shared by the Flatwoods Monster Museum page on Facebook, I made a trip all the way from California, specifically to this small town of West Virginia. And with her help, I was able to decipher why was it popular. This picture on the left here is from a book that I owned that came from the 1970s. It's a pretty pulpy fiction book that talks about monsters and aliens. But of course, the Flatwoods Monster is the biggest one on the page. Next page, please. This brings me to what we call the UFO boom and I wrote it down here, hold on. 3 meter no uchibito, which is the 3-meter tall alien. That's the nickname that the Flatwoods Monster has in Japan. And the image that was presented on CBS television by Eugene Lemon and Mrs. Kathleen May in New York found its way to Japan, and through that, it became part of what Japan was going through called a UFO boom, which was basically a trend in Japanese culture where UFOs and space-themed fiction was big. And since the Flatwoods Monster was at the very forefront, the image of the creature was kind of just used to represent all aliens, pretty much. Next page, please. As you can see, there's a lot of interpretations of specifically Japanese Flatwoods monsters. We have stickers, we have glasses holders. I've tried to find that eyeglass stand, but it's like $120 and I can't afford that. Little plastic toys, video games. We have Space Harrier 2, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Game Boy Advance games. Even Power Rangers have the Flatwoods Monster, one of their interpretations. Next page, please. Even Space Harrier 2, like I said, had the Flatwoods Monster as one of the main bosses, and it's on the back of the cover. Which, of course, as soon as I found that out, I went to find a copy of it at the local game store immediately. Next page, please. And it's even more video games, which I think is absolutely incredible, because why don't we have Mothman in more video games in the US? Except one, which I'll talk about later. Next page, please. So why is the Flatwoods Monster so prevalent in Japanese culture? I mean, the people who grew up during these UFO booms in the 50s and 70s then went on to be artists and cartoonists and manga authors that all included this representation of alien life in their culture. It's basically the mascot for a massive subculture of alien fans in Japan, which is what the whole point of the Japanese Flatwoods Monster is. And that particular Flatwoods Monster that you see on the left there, that's very, very buff. It's from the anime Sergeant Frog, which came out in the early 2000s. Next slide, please. This brings us to Grafton, West Virginia, which was on the tail end of my research trip, but it still brought out a lot of great results. I was actually in Point Pleasant when I messaged the owner of the Grafton Monster Facebook page, hey, is this page run out of actual Grafton? Yeah. Why do you ask? Well, I'm doing a research report on it, a thesis research report on it. Could we meet together and talk? Of course. And it turned out to be the director of tourism for that county. So I went to Grafton, West Virginia, which, if you don't know, next page, please, is the birthplace of the internationally known Mother's Day, first place it was celebrated, at least. But I like to think of it more for the Grafton Beast, of course. Next page, please. And then there's a local coffee house there that has all these different interpretations of the Grafton Monster up. But it's more recent interpretations because it's mostly based on how it looks in the game Fallout 76. Because of this one director of tourism, he essentially got this monster into a video game by basically harassing the game designers. Why do we have Mothman and the Flatwoods Monster but not the Grafton Beast? And you can see that sign there at the top of that coffee shop. Next page, please. How it's out of reach from everyone. That sign kept getting stolen, so they had to move it to a centralized coffee house in town. But I think it worked out for the better, only because you can sell more merchandise next to a sign in a coffee house rather than on the side of the road. Next page, please. As you can see, this is where the sighting happened and where the original sign was. So the director of tourism wanted to commemorate where the reporters saw the white naked polar bear, supposedly. Next page, please. And of course, the Grafton Monster has to cash in by selling t-shirts of itself. Because you can't have a monster these days without having a t-shirt of it. And of course, I own it. This brings us to Fallout 76. Which, if you know me, and there's a few of you in the stream right now that know me, I talk about this game all the time. But this game takes place in post-apocalyptic West Virginia after nuclear bombs have pretty much obliterated the Earth. And, next page. All three cryptids that I've talked about are in the game, like Mothman, who is an omen of death for the end of the world, fittingly, and also for the collapse of a dam that killed all the survivors after the end of the world. Next page, please. And the Flatwoods monster, who is from a race of aliens called the Zetans, who abduct people and take them back to their mothership above Earth for terrible, horrible experiments. But they made it look very close to the original design or description. Next page, please. And even in the game, you can see the Flatwoods monster sign. The director of tourism told me they came out and scanned that sign and replicated it in a 3D imaging program. Next page, please. And here's the Grafton Beast, which looks familiar because, well, that's the only, popular culture interpretation of it that wasn't by a digital artist. This particular monster was made through human experiments which caused innocent people to mutate into these giant hulking walking masses of muscle, and it's a very sad story once you find out about it. And you were killing tons of these things all the time, so you feel even more worse after that. But in conclusion, what I really gathered from my time in West Virginia and in getting in contact with these communities, both locally and around the world, these monsters inherently represent these communities. And they're mascots, and they're just part of these people's identity as a whole. When people say they're from Point Pleasant, they're immediately called out and they're met with, Mothman! You know Mothman? You're from Point Pleasant? Oh, you must know Mothman. Even though the people who grew up around these stories will just laugh and say, yeah, it's just a story. We like banking off of it, which, I mean, it's come to their great success, of course. Point Pleasant used to only have 15 out of 42 storefronts open, but now it has 36 out of 42 storefronts open ever since the Mothman statue was first introduced in town. These people capitalize in order to get people to come from all over the world to come to these little towns in the middle of nowhere to experience both their shopping and what else the community has to offer. By using the folklore, it's a draw to get people in, essentially. And also, West Virginia as a whole has greatly benefited from this crypto-tourism, as I like to call it. Because people around the world will bond over these stories from a mountainous state on the eastern part of the United States that not a lot of people go to regularly. But people specifically come to the state now to experience Mothman, Flatwoods Monster, and the Grafton Monster. And even though many can't visit these places in person, we have things like the 24-hour stream on YouTube of the Mothman statue. You can visit the statue anytime you want. Or you can fire up Fallout 76 if you have it, and go visit the statue in that game because it's still standing after the end of the world. But why do so many people like these monsters specifically like I do? I think it's honestly because of how unique these monsters are. How they all represent the state, how they all took place in the same state even. Why is this one state producing so many weird occurrences? Well, let's bunch them all together and make them a little tiny family and try to find that out. And I think that's what brings so many communities together around the world trying to figure that out. And it all adds to why West Virginia is the wild and wonderful state. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Great. Thank you, Dee. That was really, really interesting. I love how they did some really creative marketing as well as the stories. Just the stories are really interesting. So in the meantime, if any of you have questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat box. And we do have a question. Okay, when you were in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, you might have covered this already, but where did you stay? Was it at the hotel?
Yes, I stayed at the Low Hotel, which is, since it's an older hotel, it was so much different not using a key card and these big wrought iron keys that they would give you to open up these really old locks. But it was a wonderful place. It was run by wonderful people, and they had a little bar open at the end of the night where I met the city planner, Charles Humphrey, who told me he commissioned the Mothman statue.
Very cool. Sounds like a really cool place. So now when I go there, I'll know where I should stay.
Yes.
So, which I think your trip is amazing. I've thought about doing it like as a vacation. So it sounds really cool.
It's a beautiful area.
Yeah, West Virginia is so nice. And then the other thing we had a note, just I wanted to make sure, but John Keel was the person who wrote Mothman Prophecies.
John Keel.
So he stayed at that hotel, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's awesome. Does anybody have any questions? Do you want to put them in the chat box? And while we're waiting to see if anybody has questions, I'll just go ahead and share again that we have Ohio and Unnatural History. It does talk about Mothman. We don't have the Flatwoods monster or the Grafton monster, unfortunately, but they're West Virginia, of course. But the exhibit actually has been extended through Halloween of 2021. So if you haven't had a chance to come see it, it opened for 2 weeks and then we had to shut down, unfortunately, because of the pandemic. And now we're reopened and it has been extended to give people some time to see it. And we did get a lot of questions from people, are you going to extend the exhibit? So we hope people are enjoying it. And something else that caught me in your presentation, Dee, is the drawings that they had of Mothman. We actually have something kind of similar in our exhibit. If you guys come, you can play a game where you roll dice and you draw your own cryptid, and it actually gets displayed in the exhibit. So this is kind of a cool thing. So the people might be interested in that. Okay, well, I'm not seeing too many questions, so I think you really covered everything. We just want to thank everybody for joining us today. This is our second, I believe, online presentation, so we appreciate you bearing with us as we work out any bugs and learn what we're doing. And thank you so much to Dee. That was really, really interesting. Sounds like a very cool project. So we really appreciate having you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, hang on, we got a chat here. We did get a question, I think. Oh, it just says, excellent job, Dee. And this is from Tristan.
Oh.
So.
Hi, Tristan.
Yes. So thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you again to Dee. Really interesting presentation. Makes me want to go to West Virginia and learn more and see these places and get a Mothman cookie for sure.
Of course, they're delicious, honestly.
And they look really cute too. So, all right. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and have a great day.